So talking about the Jazz, there's a lot of talk, a lot of back and forth on Twitter right now. I feel like most Jazz fans, at least on social media apps, are looking for war, and it seems like it's a polarizing battle of team tank or team play-in. And they're making jokes that maybe Danny Ainge and company are frustrated that maybe there are plans to purposely maybe lose these last few games or not have the roster that could win these games, but somehow without their top guys, without Sexton and Clarkson and, Markkinen, for example, last night, the Jazz just keep finding ways to, especially in these last two games, win against tough and top tier opponents. So, Richie, what side of the argument are you on, and what have you thought about what the Jazz have looked like these last few weeks?
I am not on either side of the argument. I am in a happy middle ground right now. I think the Jazz are in an incredible place. And I'm going to put them in the same situation I would put it Miami in after LeBron. So Miami after LeBron, they had a couple years where D-Wade, Chris Bosh, they tried to get things rolling. Didn't work out too well. Eventually, they kind of just fizzled out of that era. Then they had a streak where they drafted Bam Adebayo 13th. They drafted Tyler Hero 13th. They got Jimmy Butler in free agency, and they made a finals run. They made a conference finals run. They've had some real success. And as good as those players are, I think the biggest underlying thing from their success is their coach, Eric Spoelstra. I think Will Hardy is that caliber of coach, and that's why I think the Jazz are in a really good position for the future. The Jazz, since the trade line, are 8-7. In that time, they are the top shot blocking team, largely because of Walker Kessler. They're also the top rebounding team in the NBA. And then they are pretty average with their offensive and defensive rating. Both are top 15, defensive rating 14th, offensive rating 11th. In that span, they've only had one loss out of those 7 losses that was more than 10 points. This team fights every single game, and I think that's awesome. I think that is providing very high quality experience, especially as you're going down the end of the season stretch, because you're playing against teams that are fighting for bare life. You're playing against these teams that are looking at their seeding, that are going to try to position themselves for certain seeds. You're looking at teams that are trying to figure things out before they make a championship run, like the Boston Celtics this last weekend. So the teams that the Jazz are playing they're not taking the Jazz lightly. They're playing hard. They're trying to win these games, but the Jazz come out, they play harder. And I think that speaks very loudly to the kind of coach that Will Hardy is. And because of that, I think the Jazz are in a really good position, whichever way they go. If they start losing games and tank a little bit, or if they make a play-in spot and end up competing for a play-in or playoff spot, I think that would be very valuable experience. Either way, I think the Jazz are in a great position. I don't think you can be too mad about whichever way they go. Would it be nice to have a top 10 pick in this draft? Yeah, this is a great draft. We're seeing some of those guys ball out in March Madness. Some of the guys that the Jazz could potentially draft. And with a top 10 pick, you'd have a higher chance of moving potentially into the top 4 or even the number 1 pick. That being said, you're also getting these guys very valuable experience, and we're learning so much about this team. What are the chances that Ochai Agbaji turns out to be better than one of the top 10 guys in this next draft? And we're figuring that out because of this crucial stretch. What are the chances Walker Kessler is better than one of those guys? The guy that you would draft, hypothetically. What are the chances Lauri Markkinen is? I think all the chance of those 3 guys being better than any of the guys we draft is pretty high, while I think some of those guys are really good players that are coming into the league. I just think the Jazz, the experience that they're getting right now is valuable, and they're positioning themselves in a really interesting play-in race where they're getting close game experience. They're learning how to play. Lauri Markkinen is learning how to close games. Ochai Agbaji is learning how to create for himself. Walker Kessler is learning how to make crucial stops at the end of games. And the Jazz are just in a really good place. I think it's easy to focus on the draft and who the next guys are, who's going to be coming in. But it's also just important to focus on what's going on right now with the team, with the development of some of these guys. Heck, we've seen guys blossom, just absolutely blossom the last couple of weeks. Shout outs to Chris Dunn, Simone Fontecchio, guys that have really figured out their niche in the NBA and could be rotational players as the Jazz make a playoff run, I think that's huge. And the Jazz, they still have 3 picks for this next year. And 2 of those picks are potentially lottery picks. Or they could fall out just out of the lottery, and the Jazz could end up swinging on somebody who has high upside but just might not be evaluated correctly right now. So I think the Jazz are in a really good position whichever way they go. And for those that are on Team Tank, for those that are on Team Make a Playoff Run, I just think let the season play out. Let these guys play the season out. They've deserved it. They've played so hard game after game. And Will Hardy deserves it. I think the coaching job he has done this year has just been phenomenal. And he deserves to determine his own destiny with this team.
I 100% agree with you. So maybe we'll rename it Team Destiny after your final comments there. I just think, as you mentioned, we're putting a lot of stock into this upcoming draft, which, granted, this could very well be one of the greatest drafts of all time. But then again, it hasn't happened yet. And I think where the Jazz roster is at right now, the big talk of the town this entire season was, hey, Markkanen can be a number 2 guy on a really good team, on a finals contending team. We need the number 1 guy. I don't think the Jazz's best route is to get the number 1 guy in this upcoming draft. I think the best route is to find free agency, find guys that are veterans in the league to bring veteran presence back. Because listen, the only veteran on the team right now is Kelly Olynyk. Granted, dude almost dropped a triple-double last night. Still waiting for the Jazz to get one since 2008, besides Ricky Rubio in the playoffs. But I think it has to come from veteran experience to grab that number 1 guy, to grab your shot maker, to grab your guard position. Besides that, as you mentioned, getting these young guys this needed experience, I think, is the most crucial point, the most crucial thing that the Jazz have to do towards the end of the season. The fact that the Jazz have these guys and are paying them the amount of money that they are, I don't see how any Jazz fan can be mad about that. You have, as you mentioned, Ochai Agbaji, who throughout the season was able to show flashes, and I feel like now in these last few games, he's been able to prove, hey, I'm not only a catch and shoot type of guy, but as you mentioned, I can create my own shot, especially in clutch moments. And we also know that, hey, he's good outside on the perimeter. He was able to show us he can drive to the basket. He's got length. He's got a good body build. Walker Kessler, we've mentioned multiple times, but the fact that he's already one of the most clutch defenders in the league as a rookie, like, I don't know if anyone understands how difficult that is. And I saw on Twitter that a fan was like, well, it's good that he can do it against Sabonis, but he's not doing it against Jokic or Embiid. It's like, sure, maybe Jokic and Embiid have more success against Kessler, but Kessler's still able to defend himself pretty well against the best of the best down low. And the fact that you have a guy prioritizing his defense in today's type of basketball, like, you have to value that. And the fact that Walker also has the potential to increase his offensive production in the coming years is exactly what Jazz fans would want. Because as a lot of fans have been mentioning, this is like a Rudy Gobert 2.0, but now has an offensive game. He's more mobile. He can catch it better. He grips the ball better down low. And so I don't know why anyone would be disappointed in having him be that guy moving forward, as you mentioned, rather than looking to the draft. Obviously, we know about Lauri Markkanen. Don't need to say anything more about him. But as you mentioned, you look at the teams that have had long-term success, no matter the roster. It all goes back to the coaching staff, and I think another one that you could mention is Steve Kerr with this Warriors dynasty. You've had the key pieces stay along, obviously with Steph, Clay, Draymond, but as you've moved forward, even look at last year's roster, very different than what they look like in 2015. But Steve Kerr is the type of coach that knows how to control egos, knows how to manage a squad. And so the Warriors are consistently able to just find themselves back in the playoff, no matter if we think it's a down year or if it's a really good year for them. And so the fact that they've also been able to have long-term success, I think it also goes back to that coaching staff. And you also have to look at a lot of his assistants that he's had are now head coaches in the league. Not to mention Mike Brown now, who's going to lead the Kings in his first season as head coach to their first playoff since the 2005-2006 season. So I don't think it's a conversation as much on the players, as you mentioned, as it is going back to the coaching staff, because players have vocally come out and said that Will Hardy just has that it factor. And I was watching a little segment with Juan Toscano Anderson, and he just mentioned, like, Will Hardy, I trust him immediately from the get-go. As soon as I came in here, he's one of those coaches where as a player, he just felt real to me and I could trust him. And I think it's that type of coach that can really get you far in the league. Steve Kerr mentioned it before. Like, basically, your job is to control these players' egos, make them feel good. Obviously, drop a few players along the way, but it's basically manage. It's basically just managing, and it's micromanaging. And I think Will Hardy does a really good job at that. And he's so good at getting his guys passionate about getting into the game. And you've obviously seen clips throughout the year of him in huddles. He has high IQ. We've heard that from Greg Popovich. Like, Will Hardy has done a phenomenal job, and he's not going to win Coach of the Year by any means this year. But really good season for him with his first year at the helm. The fact that only, I believe at this point in the season, only Jerry Sloan has had more wins as Utah Jazz coach at this point in their career than Will Hardy. I think at this point, Sloan had 44. And that something has to be said about that. And so I'm excited to see what this Jazz team looks like. Now, granted, the big conversation is that the Jazz have a really tough schedule up ahead. A lot of tough games. These are almost all these opponents are fighting for a playoff spot. So, Richie, what are your thoughts going into these final 10, 11 games? And what do you think the Jazz will do in this final stretch of the season?
Yeah, it's a brutal end of the season. 538 currently has the Jazz finishing 4-7 in their last 11 games. So that would put the Jazz at a record of 39-43, which would have them out of the play-in and the 9th best lottery odds. So looking ahead, you have Portland. Portland is a mess right now. Damian Lillard is awesome. He is an incredible athlete, incredible basketball player, incredible person, but Portland is awful. And they are tanking pretty obviously. Like they just do not have what it takes right now to win games. So I think that one could be a Jazz win. However, as of right now, Jordan Clarkson is listed as out. Lauri Markkanen is questionable. Colin Sexton is out. The Jazz are going to be running with the squad they ran last night, so it's possible Damian Lillard erupts for another 60, like the last time we saw Portland. Moving after that is when it gets really interesting. You play Milwaukee. Milwaukee is top of the top right now. They're the best team in the NBA. They're fantastic. And I think they're going to bring it to the Jazz. Then you play Sacramento in a rematch. I think that one could go a lot differently than we saw the other night. Sacramento obviously has their defensive issues, which I think the Jazz did a really good job of exposing last night. But they are an elite offensive team. And even though the Jazz were up by like 25 at some point, Sacramento came back, made it a close game. They were even winning at one point in that game. I think Sacramento wins that game. Going a little further, you got Phoenix. Phoenix, great. Probably no Kevin Durant. Then you got San Antonio. That's probably going to be a Jazz win. Then you go Boston, Brooklyn, Lakers, Thunder, Denver, Lakers. So those are all prospective playoff teams, all firmly in the playoffs or in a play-in spot like the Lakers. Those two Lakers games are going to be huge because both the Jazz and the Lakers, at least from the perspective of the players, are going to be hunting for a playoff spot. And I think the Lakers have a lot more pressure than the Jazz do. You know, the Jazz expectations are not high this year. We predicted to win like 20 games. The Lakers have LeBron James, who has been one of the best players in basketball for the last couple of years, if not the best. And they have very high expectations, especially with the roster moves they made at the deadline. So I think those two games are going to be really crucial, as well as the OKC game. OKC is firmly in that spot too. They're in a play-in spot. They have things going right now. I cannot believe their core of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Josh Giddey, Jalen Williams, and then they're going to add Chet Holmgren and possibly another lottery pick to that next year. With the shooting they have, with Lou Dort, with all these pieces, they are going to be good. They have made a race at the play-in, and I think that's really smart for their organization in the long term because of the playoff experience that those guys could potentially get. So it's going to be a brutal stretch to end for Utah. You're playing top of the league teams. You're playing the three top teams in Denver, Boston, Milwaukee. You're playing teams that are competitive, right? That are competing with you right now for the play-in spots. And then you're playing like Sacramento and San Antonio, who are just kind of in different spots than those other teams. But it could be a really brutal stretch for the Jazz. However, we have seen that this team can beat anybody on any given night, and they're going to take it game by game. And they're going to play harder than the other team in most of these games. They're going to come out with a game plan. Will Hardy is going to will these guys to victory if these guys are just able to execute the game plan. it's going to be a really, really fun stretch because the Jazz are looking at a playoff spot. The players want to get into the playoffs. And that would not be the worst thing in the world to get into the playoffs on year one of your rebuild, where you're just trying to figure out personnel and you've traded guys at the deadline. You've tried to become a worse team and you're still making the playoffs. What does that say about your team if you actually start trying to win and if you make some winning moves with your roster? I think the Jazz are in an incredible position, and this end of the season stretch is going to be miraculously fun to watch. Buckle your seatbelts, buckle up, bowler. It's going to be great.
First off, your interactions with Craig on Twitter, those are just phenomenal. I love that guy. So indeed, buckle up, guys. This is going to be good. But yeah, I like your diagnosis of what's going to be going on in these last few games. And when I was looking at the schedule earlier today, I am pretty sure that if these last few games go as I think they're going to go, that game in Crypto Arena, the final regular season game of the year, could very well be a nationally televised game, something that a lot of people are going to be looking at because the Lakers have a pretty, like, it's not as hard as the Jazz, but they've got a pretty tough schedule as well. They're playing the Suns, they're playing the Clippers. I believe they play the Rockets. Like, they've got a few gimmies, but they play the Thunder as well. Like, they're playing teams they're going to be fighting as well. And so it'll be interesting to see how this Jazz team shows up because I know the players really want to compete. I was able to listen to a really good podcast episode on Draymond Green's show where Laurie Marketing came on, and Laurie really wants to be competitive. He really wants the Jazz to get to a playoff spot, and I don't disagree with him. I don't know why, as a player, you'd be happy tanking in the slightest. But Laurie says he believes in the front office, and he believes that his guys can do it. They can get to the playoff. And as you mentioned, the Jazz in their first year of a rebuild could go to the playoffs. And looking at the stats, I think the Jazz have been one of the most consistently good teams in the NBA throughout their entire history. There's been very few seasons where I believe they've only had 2 seasons where they've had more than 39 losses. And the fact that the Jazz have been able to consistently win in the regular season, obviously as Jazz fans we know it doesn't really go well in the playoffs, at least as of recently. But in the regular season, the fact that we've had this consistent winning basketball, like, don't take that for granted. I mean, look at Houston right now. They've had a plan so far to just keep getting lottery picks every year. But now you have a roster filled with 19-year-olds, and it's even bigger ego checks, and it just seems like Houston's kind of taken a train that's going to lead them to nowhere. But for the Jazz, like, you have so much valuable experience coming up. And I think with a schedule like this, and again, if Clarkson's not able to come back with his dislocated finger injury, if Sexton, if his hamstring's still bothering him, like, these young guys have the opportunity to go up against the best of the best, and they can prove they can do it. They showed it to us against the Kings on Monday. The fact that they put up, I believe, one of the best quarters I've seen by a Jazz team, and it was the tank squad, the quote unquote tank squad. Like, these guys can do it. They have flashes. Do I think they're going to do it all 4 quarters for these last 11 games? Absolutely not. But I think they can put up a good fight against a lot of these guys. In my personal opinion, I think they're probably going to be putting up close to a 500 record. I think the stretch where I don't think they're going to win games is on that mini 3-game road trip. I don't think they're going to beat the Celtics or the Nets. I just feel like whenever the Jazz go east, I don't feel comfortable. Especially up like northeast. I just never feel like the Jazz can win up there. But I'm really excited to see what those last 3 home games look like, that last 3 home game stand where you have the Lakers welcoming back Beasley and Vanderbilt and company. We'll see how LeBron is maybe looking up down the stretch, because that's the other big thing. Like, if they're still trying to see if they need to win these games to get into like a play-in spot, like, you could bet your bottom dollar LeBron's going to be coming back, even if it is on 1 foot or whatever. And a lot of people are going to be watching that game. And I think this is finally where the Jazz can maybe show, like, wow, this is the tanking Jazz team and they're competing with these guys. Hey, like, maybe something happens. And I think like moments like this, and if they get into a playoff spot, then the free agents can say, hey, maybe I want to go to Utah next year. Maybe I can be their number 1 guy. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know what you think about that.
Name to keep an eye on: Jaylen Brown. He's come out on podcast. Every athlete right now has their podcast or whatever. They're appearing on podcasts, and Jaylen Brown has expressed some distaste with Boston fans. And I mean, he had a really good relationship with Will Hardy, from what I understand, as well as a great relationship with Danny Ainge, the guy that drafted him earlier than people thought Jaylen Brown was going to get drafted with that number 3 pick. So that might be something to keep an eye on. We'll see if that comes in the form of free agency or if that comes in the form of a trade. But that's just a name I would keep an eye on. Um, Also, just another note, I really do think the Jazz could get a nationally scheduled game. I'm looking at the TV schedule for that last game. Nothing's on national TV. It's a Sunday game, so that would usually be NBA TV, I believe, or maybe ESPN. And they don't have anything, so I wonder if that is like something they do by ear, kind of. I don't know. Like the last 2 days, they don't have any scheduled games on national TV. But then you look at days before that, it's TNT, ESPN, NBA TV. So maybe something to keep an eye on. Jazz could get their one nationally televised game of the year, and it could be the last game. So that'd be pretty awesome. But yeah, I mean, this end of season stretch is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I think overall there's going to be a ton of storylines to keep our eyes on. But nationally televised game for this Jazz squad, we're going to keep you updated there because I think everyone would love to see how this Jazz team looks. Obviously, I believe the last time we finished our regular season in LA was that Kobe's final game. Was that the last time we finished in
If
LA?
I know we finished that season with that game, I don't know if there's been one like that since, like an end of season stretch.
Because
I'm not sure.
maybe that's just me, but I got a little PTSD after that game where Kobe puts up like 80 shots against us and we kind of just let him. Obviously, we weren't going to the playoffs, so it wasn't really a big deal. But I don't know, man. Maybe LeBron's in for an awakening, a Kobe like awakening in that final game, but we'll keep you updated.